The College of Nurses of Ontario presents the Therapeutic Nurse-Client Relationship, revised 2006 practice standard, Protecting the Client from Abuse. 4 standard statements describe what a nurse is accountable for in the therapeutic nurse-client relationship. Each statement has accompanying indicators, which are broad statements that nurses can modify to their particular practice reality. The standard statements are therapeutic communication, client-centered care, maintaining boundaries, and protecting the client from abuse. In this chapter, we'll discuss protecting the client from abuse. The college's standard statement for protecting clients from abuse states that nurses protect the client from harm by ensuring that abuse is prevented or stopped and reported. There are 5 forms of abuse: financial, verbal and emotional, physical, sexual, and neglect. Financial abuse includes, but is not limited to, borrowing money from a client, soliciting gifts, withholding finances, holding power of attorney for a client, and abusing a client's bank accounts or credit cards. Verbal and emotional abuse includes, but is not limited to, using sarcasm, taking revenge, teasing, swearing, and using cultural slurs. Physical abuse includes, but is not limited to, hitting, pushing, shaking, slapping, and using excessive force. Sexual abuse includes, but is not limited to, using seductive or suggestive language, touching of a sexual nature, having sexual intercourse with a client or the client's significant other, and viewing pornography with a client. These behaviors are considered sexual abuse whether they're non-consensual or consensual. Neglect includes, but is not limited to, non-therapeutic confining, denying care and privileges, and withholding the basic necessities of life. The college's abuse prevention video, One is One Too Many, demonstrates the 5 forms of abuse through scenarios and provides abuse prevention practices. In one scenario, Mrs. Lawrence is constantly using the call bell. On one occasion, the nurse is delayed in responding to the bell because of an emergency. By the time she answers the bell, Mrs. Lawrence has wet the bed. The nurse scolds Mrs. Lawrence, telling her that she'll have to sit in the wet sheets until she has time to change them. Mrs. Lawrence relies on the nurses to meet her basic functional needs and is humiliated by wetting the bed. This scenario depicts emotional abuse and neglect. As well, chastising the client for wetting the bed is verbal abuse. The nurse needs to explore the meaning behind Mrs. Lawrence's behavior to discover why she is continually ringing the call bell. A toileting regimen should be part of the client's plan of care, and effective communication among all the nursing staff will ensure that Mrs. Lawrence's needs are met. Scott, a client with cerebral palsy, is given his dinner tray but doesn't receive the help he needs to eat the meal. The nurse checks in on him and, assuming that Scott doesn't want his dinner, removes the tray. Scott ends up going hungry. The nurse was neglectful by not recognizing that Scott is dependent on the nurse to meet his basic need for food. Scott endured emotional abuse because he did not know if he was going to eat that day. Nurses need to ensure effective communication among care providers about client needs, seek the specialized knowledge to provide safe, effective, and ethical care to clients with special needs, and take the time to listen to clients so they can determine client needs. Annie, an elderly woman in a long-term care facility, is confused when approached by 2 nurses who want to prepare her for a bath. The nurses start to undress Annie, but she is startled and resists their efforts. The situation escalates and Annie becomes combative and starts to cry. Struggling with Annie, forcing her to undress against her will, is physical abuse. The Regulated Health Professions Act requires regulated health professionals, including nurses, to report the sexual abuse of a client by a regulated health professional to the appropriate regulatory college. The Child and Family Services Act requires nurses to report suspected child abuse to the Children's Aid Society. A male client overhears two female nurses making sexual jokes and remarks about him. Many people think that inappropriate touching and sexual intercourse are the only forms of sexual abuse. However, making inappropriate sexual comments to and about a client is sexual abuse too. In this situation, the client also endured emotional abuse. He felt humiliated and embarrassed by the nurse's sexual comments. A nurse can't afford his wife's school expenses. He mentions this to a client in one of their regular visits. The client offers to write the nurse a check. You have now completed Chapter 5. To work through another chapter in this module, close this presentation and return to the Learning Center.